The medevac bird touched down in a whirl of dust and diesel smoke on the edge of Helmand Province, its rotors still beating the air into submission as the ramp dropped. The team waiting wasn't expecting much, just another routine extraction from a village that had seen too much war and not enough mercy. What they pulled from the back of that Black Hawk was a woman in torn civilian clothes, blood-stained and silent, her face a mask of controlled pain. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She just watched them with eyes that had seen things most people spend their whole lives trying to forget. The SEAL medic who took her vitals noticed it first, the way her breathing stayed measured despite the shrapnel wounds peppering her left side, the way her pulse barely elevated even as he cut away fabric to assess the damage. Professional. Too professional. When he asked her name, she gave him nothing but a look that could freeze diesel fuel. The team lead, a grizzled operator named Briggs who'd seen 3 tours and countless faces, knelt beside her and tried again. Still nothing. Then he saw it, half hidden beneath the blood and dirt on her forearm, a tattoo most civilians wouldn't recognize but every operator knew by heart. The trident, the wings, the anchor. The only problem was it wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't SEALs, weren't supposed to be. He looked up at his medic, then back at her. And for the first time in a very long time, Briggs didn't know what the hell he was looking at. The woman they would come to call Madam didn't speak for the first 48 hours. She accepted treatment in silence, letting the surgeons remove shrapnel from her torso and thigh without sedation, her jaw set like carved stone. The nurses whispered about her, about the scars that mapped her body like a testimony written in flesh. Old burns on her shoulders. A bullet graze across her ribs that had healed years ago. Knife work on her hands that spoke of close-quarters combat, the kind you don't walk away from unless you're better than the person holding the blade. The base commander, a colonel named Vance who'd fought in Fallujah and thought he'd seen everything, came to her bedside on the 3rd day. He brought her file, or what little existed of it, redacted, classified. Whole sections blacked out like someone had taken an eraser to her entire existence. What remained was a ghost story. A woman who'd served in capacities that officially didn't exist, in units that had no names, doing work that left no paper trail. Vance sat beside her bed and asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Who are you?" She turned her head slowly, met his eyes with a gaze that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken missions, and said one word. Nobody. It wasn't a lie. It was the truth that people like her lived with every single day. The base called her Madam because nobody knew what else to call her, and because when the intelligence officer, a sharp-eyed captain named Liu, tried to press her for details, she'd simply raised one eyebrow and said, "I don't work for you." The name stuck. It wasn't respectful, not at first. It was almost mocking, the kind of nickname soldiers give to someone they don't understand and don't particularly want to. But Madam didn't seem to care. She healed faster than anyone expected, walking the perimeter of the medical tent within a week, her limp barely noticeable except to those who knew what to look for. She moved like water, efficient and silent, never wasting a step. The younger soldiers watched her with curiosity and unease. There was something about her that didn't fit, like a puzzle piece from a different box forced into place. She didn't eat in the mess hall, didn't socialize. Didn't ask for anything except a secure line to make a single phone call, which Vance denied 3 times before finally relenting. When she hung up 15 minutes later, her expression hadn't changed, but something in the air had shifted. Vance felt it, that subtle charge that comes before a storm. He asked her what she'd said. She looked at him with those unreadable eyes and replied, "I told them I'm still alive." That should have been the end of it. But 2 days later, a helicopter arrived unannounced, unmarked, carrying 2 men in civilian clothes who didn't give names and didn't stay long. They spoke to Madam for less than 10 minutes, and when they left, she was still there. Vance cornered her afterward, demanded to know what the hell was going on. She met his frustration with calm. "They wanted to know if I was compromised," she said. And he pressed. "I told them no." Vance studied her, this woman who seemed to exist in the margins of every regulation and protocol he'd ever followed. "What are you?" he asked, not unkindly. She almost smiled. "Expensive." The truth started to unravel in pieces. the way secrets always do when too many people start asking questions. It was Liu who dug deepest, pulling threads from databases that required clearances most people didn't even know existed. What she found made her go pale. Madam wasn't just a veteran. She was a ghost, a black operations specialist who'd been declared dead 4 years earlier during a mission in Syria that officially never happened. Her real name was Cale Torrance, and before she'd been erased from every record that mattered, she'd been one of the most effective covert operators in modern military history. 12 confirmed solo extractions, 23 high-value target eliminations, 8 deep-cover insertions into hostile territory that had reshaped the intelligence landscape of 3 different theaters. She'd worked for a unit so classified it didn't have a name, just a number that changed every 6 months. And then she died, except she hadn't. Liu brought the information to Vance, her hands shaking slightly as she laid the printed documents on his desk. "This woman," Liu said, her voice barely above a whisper, "she's not supposed to exist." Vance read through the file twice, his face growing harder with each page. The official report listed Cale Torrance as killed in action during a hostage rescue operation that went wrong. No body recovered. No confirmation. Just gone. And yet here she was, alive and walking around his base like a specter made flesh. Vance looked up at Liu. "Does she know we know?" Liu shook her head. "I don't think she cares." That was the thing about Madam, Vance realized. She existed beyond the reach of people like him, beyond rank and protocol and the comfortable structures that made military life predictable. She was a weapon that had outlived its handlers. The SEALs treated Madam with cautious respect after Briggs quietly shared what he'd learned. They didn't press her with questions, didn't try to bond over shared experiences. They simply acknowledged her presence with nods and the kind of professional courtesy reserved for people who'd earned it in blood. Madam reciprocated by staying out of their way, a shadow that moved through the base without friction. But everything changed the night the base came under attack. It started with mortars, 3 impacts that lit up the eastern perimeter and sent everyone scrambling for cover. Then came the small arms fire, disciplined and coordinated, the kind that spoke of trained fighters rather than opportunistic insurgents. The base's defenders responded with practiced efficiency, but within minutes it became clear this wasn't a probing attack. This was a deliberate assault, planned and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Vance was in the operations center, coordinating the defense, when one of his officers reported that the attackers were pushing toward the medical facility, toward the high-value detainees being held there. Vance's blood went cold. They'd recently taken custody of 3 Taliban commanders, intelligence assets too valuable to lose. If the enemy reached them, everything they'd worked for would collapse. He started issuing orders, redirecting personnel, calling for air support. Then Madam walked into the operations center, fully geared in body armor she'd acquired from somewhere, carrying an M4 that looked like it had been born in her hands. "I'm going," she said. It wasn't a request. Vance stared at her. "You're a civilian, technically." She checked her weapon with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "I'm also the only person here who's held that building against a platoon-sized element before." She met his eyes. "Sir, with respect, you don't have time to argue." Madam moved through the darkness like she'd been born to it, her steps silent despite the chaos erupting around the base. 2 SEALs, Briggs and a younger operator named Cortez, fell in behind her without being asked. They'd made the choice in an instant, recognizing in her movements the kind of competence that couldn't be faked. The medical facility was 200 meters away, across open ground now lit by burning debris and tracer fire. Madam didn't hesitate. She broke into a run, keeping low, using terrain and shadows like a dancer uses a stage. Briggs and Cortez matched her pace, their weapons up and scanning. When they reached the building's outer wall, Madam dropped to one knee and hand-signaled positions with the precision of someone who'd done this so many times it was muscle memory. Briggs took left, Cortez right. Madam would breach center. They could hear voices inside now, speaking Pashto, urgent and aggressive. The enemy had already entered. Madam pulled a breaching charge from her vest, so small Briggs almost didn't see it, and placed it on the door with careful hands. She looked back at them, and in the flash of an explosion somewhere behind them, Briggs saw her face clearly. Calm, focused, alive in a way most people never experience. She triggered the charge. The door exploded inward and Madame went through the opening like smoke, her weapon already firing with controlled precision. 2 shots. 2 bodies dropped. She was moving before they hit the ground, flowing through the interior with the seals covering her angles. The enemy had 4 men inside, trying to execute the detainees before extraction became impossible. Madame killed the first one with a double tap to the chest, dropped the second with a headshot while sliding behind cover, and engaged the third so fast Cortez barely saw her move. The fourth insurgent was smarter than his companions. He'd grabbed one of the detainees, a Taliban commander named Zadran who'd been giving intelligence for 3 weeks, and put a knife to his throat. In Pashto, he screamed demands, his eyes wild with the fury of a man who knew he was already dead. Madame stood 15 feet away, her weapon trained on his head, her breathing steady. Briggs and Cortez held their positions, waiting for her call. The insurgent pressed the blade harder, drawing blood. Madame's eyes never wavered. She spoke in perfect Pashto, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You're going to die in this room. The only question is whether it happens in 3 seconds or 30. The man's hand trembled. Madame continued, still in his language. You know who I am. You know what I've done. Your commanders have told stories about me. The ghost who walks through walls. The woman who cannot be killed. Every word she spoke was a blade of its own, cutting through his resolve. She took 1 step forward. He jerked back, and in that fraction of a second when the knife moved away from Zadran's throat, Madame fired. The round took him between the eyes and he collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Zadran stumbled forward, gasping. Madame caught him with one hand, steadied him, then pushed him toward Cortez. Secure him, she ordered. Then she was moving again, checking corners, clearing spaces with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to survive in buildings where death waited around every angle. Briggs watched her work and understood why she'd been erased from official records. She was too good, too dangerous, too much of a reminder that the wars they fought required people willing to become monsters so others could remain human. By the time they extracted the detainees, the base's defenders had pushed the attackers back. The assault collapsed under coordinated fire from multiple positions, and the insurgents melted back into the darkness from which they'd come. Madame led the detainees to the operations center personally, her weapon still ready, her eyes never stopping their scan of the environment. When they reached safety, Vance met them at the entrance. He looked at the 3 rescued men, then at Madame, his face a complicated mixture of gratitude and unease. You saved them, he said. She ejected her magazine, checked it, and reloaded with automatic precision. I did my job. That's not your job anymore, Vance replied. You're not active duty. Madame looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much and somehow survived anyway. Colonel, respectfully, you don't know what my job is. She walked past him into the operations center, set her weapon down on a table and began stripping her gear with efficient movements. Briggs and Cortez followed her in, and for a moment the 3 of them stood together in silence, the kind of silence that comes after combat when words feel inadequate. Finally, Briggs spoke. That thing you did in there, the language, the shot, he paused, searching for words that could hold what he'd witnessed. That was operator-level work. World class. Madame pulled off her vest, revealing the blood-soaked bandage on her side where she'd torn stitches during the movement. She glanced at it like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. I've been doing this since you were in high school, she said without arrogance, just stating fact. Cortez, young enough to still be impressed by legends, asked the question they were all thinking. How many missions? Madame met his eyes, enough that I stopped counting. The story of what happened that night spread through the base like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling. By morning, Madame had become something between a hero and a myth, a woman who'd materialized from nowhere and saved lives with skills that belonged in classified files and Hollywood movies. The SEALs who'd fought beside her treated her differently now, with the unmistakable respect of professionals recognizing one of their own. When she walked through the base, soldiers stepped aside not out of fear but out of deference. Vance called her into his office 2 days later. She came wearing clean clothes, her wounds freshly dressed, her expression as unreadable as ever. He gestured to a chair. She remained standing. Vance sighed, picked up a folder from his desk and held it out to her. "Your real file," he said, "or what little exists of it. Madam didn't take it. I know what's in it." "Then you know that officially you don't exist." She almost smiled. "I've been not existing for 4 years, Colonel. I'm very good at it." Vance set the folder down. "The men from Langley want you back. They say you're too valuable to stay off the board." "What did you tell them?" "That I'd consider it." She shifted her weight, and he noticed the slight wince she tried to hide. And she looked out the window at the base, at the soldiers moving through their routines, at the helicopters sitting idle on the flight line. "And I told them I'd think about whether I want to go back to being a ghost, or whether I'm tired of haunting the living." Vance studied her face, searching for something beneath the surface. "What do you want, Cale?" Nobody had called her by her real name in so long that hearing it felt like being struck. Cale Torrance stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of that name settle over her shoulders like a coat she'd forgotten she owned. What did she want? The question was harder than any mission briefing, more complex than any tactical challenge. She'd spent 4 years being dead, moving through the world's shadows, doing work that left no trace, solving problems that governments couldn't acknowledge. She'd been efficient, effective. Empty. Vance waited for her answer with the patience of a man who understood that some questions took time. Finally, she spoke. "I want to stop pretending that killing people for the right reasons makes you anything other than a killer." The honesty in her voice surprised them both. Vance leaned back in his chair. "You think you're damned?" She met his eyes. "I think I'm too far gone to know the difference anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of all the things neither of them could say. Then Vance opened a drawer and pulled out another folder, this one thinner. "There might be another option," he said carefully, "something different." Cale looked at the folder but didn't reach for it. "What kind of different?" "The kind where you use your skills to train the next generation instead of adding to your body count." He slid the folder across the desk. "Instructor position. Advanced combat tactics. No more black ops. No more disappearing." She stared at the folder like it was a bomb. "Why would you offer me that?" "Because," Vance said quietly, "someone like you shouldn't die alone in a country that won't even acknowledge you existed." Cale took the folder. She didn't open it, just held it in her hands and felt its weight. It was lighter than a weapon, heavier than hope. She looked at Vance, this colonel who'd fought his own wars and somehow managed to stay human through all of it. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I don't want special treatment. I don't want acknowledgement. I just want to do the work." Vance nodded. "That's all I'm asking." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing." "Yes." "The men who came from Langley. Tell them I'm still dead. Tell them you never found me." Vance considered this, the implications rippling out like stones dropped in still water. "And if they don't accept that?" "Then you remind them that ghosts don't take orders," she said. "They haunt people until the living learn to let go." She left before he could respond, walking out into the Afghan sunlight with the folder tucked under her arm. Behind her, Vance sat in his office and made a decision that would cost him politically but save him morally. He picked up his secure line and made a call. When the voice on the other end demanded to know the status of Cale Torrance, Vance said 3 words that would close a chapter and open another. "Unable to locate." Then he hung up and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he'd done the right thing for someone who'd spent a lifetime doing the wrong things for the right reasons. Outside, Cale found a quiet corner of the base and opened the folder. The position was real, the opportunity genuine. For the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't end with her name on a wall of stars that nobody would ever see. Training the next generation turned out to be harder than any combat mission Cale had ever run. The first class they assigned her was composed of 22 Special Forces candidates, all men, all convinced they were the hardest thing walking. When she entered the classroom on the first day, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect. She saw it in their faces, the skepticism, the barely concealed amusement. A woman was going to teach them about combat, about survival, about the skills that separated the living from the dead. Kale didn't introduce herself with words. She simply wrote two things on the board. First, a number, 173. Second, a question, how many of you have killed someone with your bare hands? The room stayed silent, but the quality of that silence changed. She turned to face them, her eyes moving across each face with the precision of someone cataloging weaknesses. That number is how many confirmed enemy kills I have, she said, her voice carrying without rising. 32 of them were with my hands, 17 with a knife. The rest with weapons you'll learn to use if you're good enough to pass this course. She let that sink in, watched the calculations happening behind their eyes. Most of you won't make it, she continued. Not because you're not tough enough or strong enough. You won't make it because you think being hard means never being afraid, and that kind of thinking gets you killed in the real world. One of the candidates, a squared-away sergeant named Morrison, raised his hand. Kale nodded at him. "Ma'am, what's your background?" She smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. The kind they don't put in your official file. Over the next 6 weeks, Kale systematically broke down everything those candidates thought they knew about combat. She didn't do it with cruelty, but with the relentless precision of someone who'd survived by being better than everyone trying to kill her. She taught them that speed without accuracy was just panic with motion. That strength without technique was just exhaustion waiting to happen. That courage without fear was just stupidity wearing a medal. She ran them through scenarios that had no good answers, forced them to make choices between bad and worse, and showed them that real combat wasn't about winning. It was about surviving long enough to fight again. Morrison became her most dedicated student, perhaps because he'd been the most skeptical at first. He stayed after class, asking questions that went beyond technique into philosophy. One evening, as she was cleaning the weapons used in training, he approached her carefully. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Kale didn't look up from the rifle she was disassembling. "You can ask. Whether I answer is different. How do you deal with it? The killing. The things you've had to do." She paused, her hand still on the weapon, and for a moment she was back in a dozen different rooms in a dozen different countries, standing over bodies that had been people with families and dreams before she'd made them into problems solved. "You don't deal with it," she said finally. "You carry it. Every single one. And if you ever get to a point where it doesn't weigh anything anymore, that's when you need to stop, because that's when you've stopped being a soldier and become something else." Morrison absorbed this, his young face serious. "What do you become?" She met his eyes. "A monster. And monsters don't retire. They just eat themselves from the inside until there's nothing left." The training intensified as the weeks progressed. Kale pushed her students harder than any instructor they'd ever had, but she also taught them things that weren't in any manual. How to read a room in 3 seconds and identify every threat and exit. How to move through hostile territory using nothing but environmental awareness and disciplined patience. How to make a kill shot from 500 meters with a crosswind and failing light. But more importantly, she taught them how to think like the people they'd be hunting, to understand that every enemy was just another human being trying to survive in a world that had made them into combatants. One afternoon, during a live-fire exercise, one of her students froze. A combat veteran named Tors who'd been shot twice in Iraq and carried the scars to prove it. They were running through a hostage rescue scenario, and Tors got to the final room, weapon up, and simply stopped. Kale watched from the observation position, seeing in his stillness the ghost of some trauma reasserting itself. She didn't call it out over the radio. She simply walked onto the course, her boots crunching on the gravel, and stood beside him. Tors' hands were shaking, his breathing rapid. Kale placed one hand on his shoulder. "What do you see?" she asked quietly. He swallowed hard. "I see Baghdad. I see my team leader bleeding out because I was 3 seconds too slow." She nodded, understanding. "That's not what's in that room, Tors. That's what's in your head. I know, ma'am, but I can't make it go away." "You're not supposed to make it go away," she said. "You're supposed to carry it through that door and do the job anyway. That's what makes you different from everyone who never had to make that choice." She squeezed his shoulder once. "Ready?" He took a breath, then another. "Ready." They cleared the room together. By the time the course ended, 15 of the original 22 candidates had washed out. The 7 who remained weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who'd learned what Kale had been trying to teach them, that survival wasn't about individual excellence, but about understanding your limitations and fighting anyway. The graduation ceremony was small, just Vance and a few other officers. Kale stood at attention as each candidate received their certification, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, pride maybe, or just relief that she'd managed to pass on knowledge paid for in blood without costing anyone their life in the learning. Morrison approached her afterward, extending his hand. "Thank you, ma'am, for what you taught us, for treating us like we mattered." Kale shook his hand, nodding the calluses that matched her own. "You did matter. You all did. That's why I pushed you so hard." He hesitated, then asked the question she'd been expecting. "Will you keep teaching? Or are you going back to operational work?" She looked past him at the Afghan mountains, at the sky turning gold with evening light at the base that had become something like home. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to believe I'm done with that life." But there was truth in what she'd told Morrison weeks earlier about carrying the dead and what happened when the weight disappeared. She could feel them still, every person she'd killed, every mission that had ended with silence and smoke. They were her constant companions, her burden and her proof that she'd been real, that her existence had mattered even if it could never be acknowledged. Maybe, she thought, teaching was its own kind of atonement. The decision came for her rather than from her, delivered in a manila envelope by a courier who wouldn't meet her eyes. Kale opened it in her quarters, a small room that had become cluttered with the detritus of someone trying to build a normal life. Books on pedagogy, notes for lesson plans, a photograph of her graduating class that Morrison had insisted she keep. The envelope contained orders, but not from anyone in the official chain of command. The letter inside was typed on paper with no letterhead, signed with initials that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know better. She read it twice, feeling the familiar cold settle in her stomach. They wanted her for one more mission. Not wanted, the letter clarified. Needed. A high-value target had surfaced in Yemen, someone whose capture could prevent an attack that would kill hundreds. The asset who'd been tracking him had gone dark. They needed someone who could go in alone with no support and either extract the asset or eliminate the target. Someone expendable enough that if it went wrong, there'd be no diplomatic incident. Someone good enough that it wouldn't go wrong. Kale set the letter down and stared at the photograph of her students. She told them that monsters don't retire, that they eat themselves from the inside. She'd believed it when she said it, and she believed it now. The question was whether she was ready to become that monster again, or whether she'd walk away and let someone else carry this particular darkness. She picked up a secure phone that she wasn't supposed to have and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago. The voice that answered was tired and familiar. "This is Torrance," she said. "I got your letter. And I need to know if this is really necessary or if you're just recycling old assets because it's easier than training new ones." The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Keating, a handler she'd worked with for 3 years before her official death. He'd been the one to help her disappear, to scatter her identity across enough false records that nobody could track her unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. "Tell me it's necessary," Kale said, her voice flat. "Tell me this isn't just convenience wearing a national security label." There was a long pause, and when Keating spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent too long making impossible choices. "It's necessary," he said. "The target is Ibrahim Khalin. He's planning to detonate a truck bomb at a marketplace in Sana'a during Friday prayers." Kale felt the name settle into her memory. She knew Khalin by reputation, a bomb maker who'd killed dozens across 3 countries. If it's so urgent, why not use a drone strike? "Because he's meeting with our asset who's providing us intelligence on 5 other cells. If we kill Khalin, we lose the asset and the intelligence. If we extract them both, we dismantle an entire network." Kale closed her eyes, seeing the equation laid out in stark terms. 1 mission, 2 lives saved immediately, dozens or hundreds saved in the long term, and all it cost was her putting back on the skin she'd been trying to shed. "How long do I have?" 72 hours. She exhaled slowly. "I'll need equipment, already staged at the safe house in Aden. Authorization codes." Keating rattled off a string of numbers and letters that she committed to memory without writing down. Then he said something she wasn't expecting. "Cale, if you do this, I can't promise you'll be able to come back. To the teaching, to any of it. This is the kind of mission that has follow-ups and follow-ups to the follow-ups. I know." She looked at Morrison's photograph again. "I've always known." Cale left the base at dawn, carrying nothing but a small pack and the weight of a decision she'd already made. She didn't say goodbye to Vance or her students. Didn't leave a note. She simply walked to the flight line, showed the right credentials to the right person, and climbed aboard a transport helicopter that wasn't officially flying anywhere. The crew didn't ask questions. People who flew missions like this had learned long ago that questions were dangerous luxuries. They dropped her in Aden 12 hours later, a city that smelled of salt water and diesel and the particular desperation that comes from being caught between competing powers. The safe house was in the old quarter, a 3-story building with peeling paint and a door that opened to a code she'd been given. Inside, she found everything Keating had promised: weapons, documents, money in 4 different currencies, a laptop with encrypted communications, and a file on Ibrahim Collin that was thorough enough to be disturbing. She spent 6 hours studying that file, memorizing faces and patterns and the small details that meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Collin was careful, almost paranoid. He never slept in the same place twice, never met contacts in predictable locations. Used family members as both couriers and shields, knowing that most operations would hesitate to risk civilian casualties. The asset, a Yemeni national named Rashid who'd been feeding intelligence for 18 months, was scheduled to meet Collin in 60 hours at a location to be confirmed. Cale's mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Infiltrate the meeting. Extract both Rashid and Collin without triggering Collin's security protocols. Deliver them to a pickup point 15 kilometers outside the city. Do all of this without support, without backup, and without leaving any evidence that Americans had been involved. The insertion went smoothly, which made Cale nervous. In her experience, operations that started easy ended hard. She entered Yemen on a fishing boat, paid the captain in cash that bought his silence, and made her way into Sana'a using public transportation and her fluent Arabic. She darkened her skin, wore local clothes, and moved with the tired patience of someone who belonged to the landscape. 48 hours before the meeting, Rashid made contact through a dead drop, a message hidden in a marketplace stall that sold cheap electronics. The location was confirmed: an abandoned textile factory on the southern edge of the city, a building that had been shuttered for years and provided enough privacy for the kind of conversation Collin needed. Cale scouted the location over 2 days, noting entrances and exits, sight lines and dead zones. Collin would bring security, probably 3 or 4 men who were competent enough to be dangerous but not so skilled they couldn't be managed. The real challenge was Rashid. If he knew extraction was coming, he'd been told to wear blue. If he was compromised, he'd wear red. If the meeting was a trap, he wouldn't show at all. On the morning of the operation, Cale positioned herself in a building across from the factory, her rifle assembled and ready, her eyes scanning for any sign that the situation was worse than anticipated. She'd done missions like this dozens of times, but it never got easier. Every operation was its own unique puzzle, and one wrong move could turn the solution into a bloodbath. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, vehicles began to arrive. First came Collin in a beat-up Toyota, flanked by 2 men carrying AKs with the casual competence of experienced fighters. Then came Rashid in a different vehicle, alone, wearing blue. Cale exhaled slowly. So far, everything was going according to plan, which meant it was about to fall apart. Collin and Rashid entered the factory, their security remaining outside. Cale watched through her scope as the 2 bodyguards took positions that gave them good fields of fire but left them exposed to anyone shooting from elevation. Amateurs, she thought, or maybe just tired. This war had been going on long enough that even competent fighters made mistakes born from exhaustion. She had 15 minutes, maybe 20, before the meeting concluded. 15 minutes to cross 200 meters of open ground, neutralize the security, enter the building, and convince both Colin and Rashid to come quietly. She'd done harder things, but not by much. Kale broke down her rifle, packed it away, and pulled out a suppressed pistol that fit her hand like it had been made for her. Maybe it had been. She didn't remember anymore. There were too many weapons, too many missions, too many bodies left behind in too many countries. She moved down from her overwatch position using stairs that smelled of urine and decay, emerged into an alley, and began her approach. The first bodyguard never saw her coming. She moved up behind him using the vehicle as cover, wrapped her arm around his throat, and applied pressure to the carotid arteries until he went limp. She lowered him quietly to the ground, zip-tied his hands and feet, and moved on to the second guard. He was more alert, turning at some sound or instinct, his weapon starting to rise. Kale shot him twice in the chest with her suppressed pistol, the shots sounding like heavy coughs in the afternoon air. He dropped without a sound. She dragged his body behind the vehicle, checked his pulse to confirm the kill, and moved to the factory entrance. Inside, she could hear voices speaking Arabic, discussing logistics and timing with the calm precision of people planning mass murder. Kale entered the factory like smoke, her weapon leading, her steps silent on the concrete floor. The building was a maze of abandoned machinery and shadows, perfect for someone who knew how to use terrain to her advantage. She could see Colin and Rashid now, standing near a table covered with papers and what looked like circuit diagrams. Colin was gesturing animatedly, explaining something technical. Rashid was nodding, asking questions that sounded genuine but were probably just intelligence gathering. Neither of them had security inside the building, which was either confidence or stupidity. Kale moved to within 10 meters before Rashid spotted her. To his credit, his face barely changed, just the slightest widening of his eyes. Colin, less trained in deception, spun around reaching for a weapon. Kale shot him in the shoulder, a precise round that shattered his clavicle and took his gun hand out of commission. He screamed and went down, and Kale was on him before the echo faded, her knee on his chest, her pistol pressed against his forehead. In Arabic, she said 2 words, "Don't move." Rashid raised his hand slowly, his face pale. "You're American." She glanced at him, confirming the blue shirt, the recognition in his eyes. "I'm your ride out of here." Colin was cursing, trying to reach his weapon with his left hand. Kale slammed his head against the concrete, not hard enough to knock him out but hard enough to get his attention. "You can walk or I can drag you," she said. "Your choice." He chose to walk, or at least stumble, as she zip-tied his hands and hauled him upright. Rashid moved to help, and together they got Colin mobile. Outside, Kale could hear voices, more security arriving earlier than expected. The extraction should have been a controlled withdrawal, a careful movement through planned routes to a vehicle staged 3 blocks away. Instead, it became a running gunfight through streets that erupted with hostile fire the moment they cleared the factory. Colin's people had arrived in force, 6 vehicles and at least 15 fighters, more than Kale's intelligence had suggested. She pushed Colin and Rashid behind a concrete barrier, returned fire with controlled bursts that bought them seconds, and keyed her radio. "Extraction compromised," she transmitted. "Need immediate support at primary location." The response was crackling static, then Keating's voice cutting through. "Negative on support. You're outside the authorization window." Kale shot 2 fighters who'd gotten too brave, watched them drop, and felt the familiar cold rage building. "Then I need authorization expanded." "Negative. Mission is dark. No support available." She processed this in the space between heartbeats, understood that she'd been hung out to dry, that this mission had always been expendable, and so had she. "Fine," she said. "Mark me as KIA if I don't report in 1 hour." Then she switched frequencies and did something she'd sworn she'd never do. She called for help from the people she'd left behind. The radio crackled, then Briggs's voice came through, confused and urgent. "Say again, you're breaking up." Kale gave him her coordinates, her situation, and a simple request. "I need an exit, and I need it now." There was a pause, then Morrison's voice, younger and determined. "We're wheels up in 5 minutes. Hold position." Kale looked at Colin, bleeding and defiant, at Rashid, terrified but still functional, and made a decision. They're coming, she told them. Try not to die before they get here. 15 minutes felt like hours while Kale held the position. She'd moved them to a better defensive spot, a burned-out building that offered cover and multiple exits, and set up a fighting position that maximized her fields of fire. Colin had stopped cursing and started praying, which she found oddly comforting. Rashid stayed quiet, conserving ammunition and taking shots only when he had clean targets. The kid was better than she'd expected, probably better than his handlers knew. The insurgents probed their position 3 times, testing defenses, trying to find weaknesses. Kale repelled them with disciplined fire and 2 grenades she'd been saving for emergencies. Bodies piled up in the street, and she felt nothing except the mechanical satisfaction of problems solved through superior marksmanship. When the helicopter appeared, a Black Hawk flying low and fast with door gunners laying down suppressive fire, Kale felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Not because she'd been afraid of dying. She'd made peace with that long ago, but because she wasn't going to have to die alone, abandoned by the people she'd spent her life serving. The helicopter landed in the street, rotors kicking up dust and debris. Morrison jumped out first, weapon up, covering their movement. Briggs followed, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. They established a perimeter while Kale dragged Colin toward the bird, Rashid following close behind. Contact left, Morrison shouted, engaging targets. Briggs shifted to cover him, his weapon chattering in controlled bursts. Kale pushed Colin into the helicopter, boosted Rashid up behind him, then turned to provide covering fire for Morrison and Briggs as they withdrew. The 3 of them moved in synchronization, a ballet of violence and trust, each covering the others until they were all aboard and the helicopter was lifting, climbing, escaping. The flight back to the base was silent except for the rotors and the labored breathing of people who just survived something that should have killed them. Colin sat zip-tied and sullen, his shoulder roughly bandaged by the helicopter's medic. Rashid stared out the window like he couldn't quite believe he was still alive. Morrison and Briggs sat across from Kale, their faces asking questions they were too professional to voice during an operation. She met their eyes, acknowledging what they'd done, what they'd risked. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Morrison shook his head. "We don't leave people behind, even ghosts." Briggs leaned forward, his expression serious. "You want to tell us what the hell that was?" "Off-book extraction," Kale said. "Target acquisition that went sideways. No support authorization." "So you called us," Morrison said. "Yeah, I called you. Because you're the only people I trust to pull me out of hell without asking why I was there in the first place." That earned her a slight smile from Morrison, a nod from Briggs. When they landed, Vance was waiting on the tarmac, his face a storm of barely controlled fury. Kale climbed out of the helicopter, helped transfer the prisoners to waiting security, and then walked to meet whatever consequences were coming. Vance didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with eyes that had seen too much betrayal and not enough loyalty. Then he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "My office. Now." She followed him across the base, past soldiers who stopped to watch, past buildings that had become familiar during her brief attempt at normal life. When they reached his office, Vance closed the door and turned on her. "You want to explain why I just received a call from Langley asking why I authorized an unsanctioned operation in Yemen?" Kale stood at attention, not because regulation required it but because respect did. "Sir, I received orders for a black op from my former handler. Target acquisition and asset extraction. No authorization was requested from your command because the mission was classified above your clearance level." Vance's face went dark. "That's bullshit and we both know it. Nobody runs operations through my base without my knowledge." She met his eyes. "They do if the operations are dark enough and the people running them don't care about chain of command." He studied her, seeing in her stillness the truth of what she was saying. "How long have they been using you?" "4 years, officially dead but operationally active." Vance moved to his desk, leaned against it, suddenly looking very tired. "And you just kept going, taking missions that nobody would acknowledge if they went wrong." She nodded. "That's what ghosts do, Colonel. We haunt the spaces between policy and reality. He absorbed this, the implications spreading out like cracks in ice. The men who pulled you out, Morrison and Briggs, did they know what they were getting into? No, sir. They came because I asked and because they're good men who don't leave people behind. Vance was quiet for a long moment, thinking through angles and consequences. Finally, he spoke. You're done. The missions, the handler, all of it. Done. Cale felt something twist in her chest. Sir, I don't think it works that way. Then we make it work that way, Vance said. Because I'm not running a base where my people get used as expendable assets by handlers who don't have the courage to wear a uniform. You're going to stay here, keep teaching, and learn what it means to be part of something that doesn't throw you away when you become inconvenient. The interrogation of Ibrahim Khalin took 3 days and yielded intelligence that dismantled 2 terror networks and prevented 4 planned attacks. Rashid was debriefed, paid his contracted fee, and relocated to a third country where he could start over without looking over his shoulder. The official record of the Yemen operation was classified so deeply that even most generals would never know it happened. Cale's name appeared nowhere in any document, just as it hadn't appeared in any official record for 4 years. But something had changed, something fundamental in how she saw herself and her place in the machinery of war. She'd called for help and help had come, not from handlers who saw her as a tool, but from soldiers who saw her as a person worth saving. Morrison found her on the 4th day after the operation, sitting on the edge of the flight line watching helicopters practice insertions. He sat beside her without asking, comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. You okay? He asked eventually. She considered lying, decided he deserved better. I don't know anymore. What okay looks like for people like me. He nodded like he understood, though she doubted he really could. The guys are talking about what you did, about Yemen. Let them talk, she said. Stories are all soldiers have when the missions end. Morrison pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her. We took a vote, all 7 of us from your class. We want you to know something. She unfolded the paper and read words that hit harder than any bullet. We would follow you into hell and back because you already went there and showed us the way home. Her throat tightened. Morrison, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who's survived longer than I should have. He stood up, looked down at her with eyes that were young but not naive. Maybe that's what heroism looks like, he said. Not the people who never fall, but the ones who get back up and keep teaching others how to stand. Vance called an unusual meeting 2 weeks later, gathering Cale, Morrison, Briggs, and 4 other senior operators in a secure conference room. When everyone was seated, he activated a screen that showed a map of Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, marked with red circles indicating terrorist activity. Gentlemen and Cale, he began, I've been authorized to brief you on a new initiative. It's being called the Shepherd Program, and it's designed to address a problem we've been ignoring for too long. He clicked to the next slide, showing casualty statistics and failed operations. We're losing experienced operators to burnout, PTSD, and administrative decisions that waste talent. Meanwhile, we're sending young soldiers into situations they're not prepared for, with training that doesn't match reality. The Shepherd program aims to fix both problems by pairing veteran operators with active units in advisory roles. Cale felt the attention in the room shift toward her. Vance met her eyes. Cale, you've proven something important, that the skills that keep people alive in combat can be taught, but only by people who have survived what they're teaching. I'm offering you a position as lead instructor for Shepherd, with full authority to design curriculum and select personnel. She looked around the room, seeing in the faces of Morrison and Briggs and the others a reflection of something she'd thought she'd lost. Purpose. Not the dark purpose of hunting targets and eliminating threats, but the cleaner purpose of keeping people alive. What would this position entail, she asked. Everything you've been doing, Vance said, but formalized and expanded. You train instructors who train units. You develop doctrine. You'd have a say in how we prepare the next generation for the wars we're actually fighting instead of the wars we wish we were fighting. It was tempting, more than tempting. What's the catch? Vance smiled slightly. You'd have to accept a commission. You'd be back on the books, officially existing with all the accountability that comes with it. No more ghost work, no more deniable operations. She thought about this, about trading shadows for sunlight, about becoming visible after years of invisibility. What rank? Major to start, with potential advancement based on performance. The room waited for her answer. Kale looked at each face, seeing in them the reflection of a choice she'd been avoiding since she'd been declared dead 4 years ago. Finally, she spoke. "I accept, on one condition. Name it, my students," she said. "The 7 who graduated my first course. They're part of this program. They help design it, help run it, help make sure we're actually fixing the problems instead of just creating new ones." Vance extended his hand. "Deal." They shook, and Kale Torrance officially came back from the dead. The Shepherd program started small, just Kale and her 7 graduates running pilot courses for select units. They taught everything from basic combat medicine to advanced tactical decision-making, but more importantly, they taught the why behind the how. They explained that the goal wasn't to create killers, but to create survivors, people who could do violence when necessary but didn't lose themselves in the process. Word spread quickly. Units that went through Shepherd training performed better, lost fewer people, and demonstrated higher levels of tactical flexibility. Within 6 months, the program expanded to 3 bases. Within a year, it became standard doctrine for Special Operations Command. Kale found herself doing something she'd never expected. She became a visible part of the military community, her name appearing in briefings and after-action reports, her methods studied and debated. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. But it was also real in a way her previous life had never been. She had an office now, a small room with a desk and a window that looked out on the flight line. She had students who knew her name and her call sign, which someone had officially recorded as Madam, turning a mocking nickname into a badge of honor. She had colleagues who respected her not because they feared her, but because they'd seen her teach and recognized excellence when they encountered it. Morrison, now a captain himself, served as her second-in-command, handling logistics and coordination while she focused on curriculum. Briggs rotated through every few months, bringing operational insights from the field that kept their training relevant. The other graduates scattered across the military, each running their own version of Shepherd at different bases, spreading the doctrine like missionaries of practical survival. One evening, as she was finishing a particularly brutal training day, Vance stopped by her office. He looked at the photographs she'd hung on the wall, class after class of graduates, hundreds of faces that represented thousands of saved lives. "You did this," he said. "Built something that matters." She shook her head. "We did this. You gave me the chance when you could have sent me back to the shadows." He accepted the correction with a nod. "Still, it's remarkable. Most people don't get a second act, let alone one this successful." She looked at the photographs, at Morrison's face in the first class, at all the others who'd come after. "I'm not sure this is a second act," she said. "Maybe it's just the first time I've done something that wasn't about taking life. Maybe that's what matters." 3 years into the Shepherd program, Kale received a visitor she hadn't expected. Keating arrived unannounced, older and more worn than she remembered, carrying a folder that looked too familiar. She met him in a conference room, keeping her distance, her guard up. He set the folder on the table between them. "I'm not here for what you think," he said. "I'm here to apologize." She didn't touch the folder. "For which part?" "For using you until you broke, for throwing you away when you became inconvenient, or for trying to pull you back in when I needed you." "All of it," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "You deserved better. We all knew it, but we kept using you because you were too good at what you did." She sat down across from him, studying his face for signs of deception. "So why are you here now?" "Because the folder," he pushed it toward her, "contains your complete operational history. Everything you did, everyone you saved, every mission that officially never happened. It's been declassified, at least to the extent that you can read it without facing prosecution." She stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. "Why would I want that?" Keating met her eyes. "Because you spent 4 years thinking you were a monster, and you deserve to know the truth. That you saved more lives than most people even know exist." That every mission you ran, every target you eliminated, was part of something bigger than any of us understood. She reached for the folder slowly, opened it, and began reading. Page after page of operations, intelligence assessments, lives saved through actions she'd taken while believing she was just a tool being used and discarded. There were missions she barely remembered, targets she'd eliminated without knowing the full context. And now, seeing the intelligence reports, the follow-up assessments, the cascading effects of her work, she understood. Kale read through the night, absorbing the weight of a life she'd lived without fully understanding its impact. The file contained missions she'd forgotten, people she'd saved without knowing their names, terror attacks prevented because she'd eliminated the right person at the right time. But it also contained the cost, the psychological evaluations that charted her declining mental health, the handler notes that documented her increasing isolation and detachment. The recommendation, buried deep in the file, that she be retired because she was approaching operational burnout and showing signs of psychological fragmentation. They'd known she was breaking and they'd kept using her anyway. When she finished reading, dawn was breaking outside the window. Keating had waited through the night, sitting patiently while she processed her own history. She closed the folder and looked at him. "What do you want me to say? That it was worth it? That I forgive you?" He shook his head. "I don't want your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered, and that the people responsible for using you the way we did are trying to make sure it doesn't happen again." "How?" she asked. "By building programs like yours," he said. "By taking people like you and Morrison and Briggs and giving them the authority to train the next generation differently. By making sure that competence doesn't become a death sentence and that the best operators aren't used until they break." She stood up, walked to the window, watched the base waking up to another day. "I spent 4 years dead," she said, "learning to live again without knowing if I deserved to. And now you're telling me that everything I did, all the darkness I carried, it was necessary and important and part of something larger." He joined her at the window. "I'm saying it mattered. Whether it was worth the cost is something only you can decide." Keating left the base that afternoon, and Kale never saw him again. She heard later that he'd retired, that the agency was undergoing reforms, that people were finally starting to ask questions about the human cost of operations that officially never happened. The folder he'd left became her most carefully guarded possession, locked in a safe that only she could access. She never shared its contents, not even with Morrison or Vance. Some weights were meant to be carried alone. The Shepherd program continued to grow, becoming not just a training initiative but a philosophy about how to prepare soldiers for the realities of modern war. Kale found herself briefing generals, advising policymakers, and occasionally appearing in conferences where people used words like doctrine and institutional knowledge. She wore her uniform with pride now, the rank insignia that declared her officially existent, officially important. But she never forgot what she'd been, the ghost who'd haunted the margins of the war on terror, doing work that couldn't be acknowledged because acknowledgement would raise questions nobody wanted to answer. The call sign Madam became legendary in special operations circles, not because of what she'd done in the shadows, but because of what she was doing in the light. Young soldiers heard stories about her, about the instructor who'd been so good at killing that they'd brought her back from the dead to teach people how to survive. The stories grew and changed in the telling, becoming mythology that served a purpose beyond simple truth. They reminded people that competence could be learned, that survival was a skill rather than luck, and that the best operators were the ones who came home and taught others what they'd learned. Morrison got promoted to major and took over day-to-day operations of Shepherd, freeing Kale to focus on program development and strategic planning. Briggs retired from active service, but stayed on as a consultant, his experience invaluable in keeping their training grounded in operational reality. 5 years after accepting Vance's offer, Kale stood in front of a graduating class of 200 students, the largest cohort Shepherd had ever trained. They came from every branch of service, every specialty, united by the shared experience of learning from people who'd survived what they were being prepared to face. She looked out at their faces and saw Morrison's determination, Tor's courage to keep fighting despite his demons, and the potential of a generation that might fight wars differently because they'd been taught differently. When you leave here, she told them, you're not just taking tactical skills back to your units. You're taking a responsibility to keep people alive, to make good decisions under pressure, and to remember that every enemy was once just a person who made different choices than you did. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I spent years being very good at killing people. I was so good at it that they used me until I almost forgot how to be anything else. But the most important thing I ever learned wasn't how to take a life. It was how to save them, how to pass on knowledge that keeps people breathing, and how to build something that lasts longer than any individual mission. The room was absolutely silent, 200 soldiers hanging on every word. You will face darkness, she continued. You will make choices that haunt you. You will do things that you can't undo and carry weights that never get lighter. But if you do it right, if you learn what we've been teaching and pass it on to those who come after you, then maybe the wars we fight will cost fewer lives and the people who fight them will come home more whole than I did. She stepped back, came to attention and saluted them. Dismissed. They rose as one, returned the salute, and filed out to begin the rest of their lives. Morrison found her afterward, his face proud. That was a hell of a speech. She smiled slightly. I meant every word. I know, he said. That's why it worked. The memorial ceremony happened on a gray morning when the sky threatened rain but never quite delivered. It had taken years of quiet lobbying, but finally official permission had been granted to dedicate a monument to the operators who'd served in missions that couldn't be acknowledged during their lifetimes. The monument was simple, just a black granite wall with names carved in silver, and beside each name, the years of service and a single word: remembered. Cale stood before it with Vance, Morrison, Briggs, and dozens of others who'd served in shadows and survived to see sunlight. Her own name was there, carved between others she'd known and others she'd never met. Major Cale Torrance, it read, years of service classified, and beneath it a quote she'd chosen herself: the hardest battles leave the quietest scars. Vance spoke first, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. We gather here to remember those who served in ways we cannot fully discuss, in places we cannot officially acknowledge, doing work that shaped our world without recognition or thanks. These men and women were our best, our most capable, and too often our most forgotten. He turned to Cale. Major Torrance has spent the last 5 years teaching us that the courage to fight is matched only by the courage to teach others how to survive those fights. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. When I was declared dead, she began, I believed it was because I'd become expendable, that I'd been used up and thrown away. But I've learned something different since then. I learned that sometimes the only way to survive darkness is to walk all the way through it and come out the other side willing to light a candle for those still walking. The metaphor was simple, maybe too simple, but it resonated. She continued. Every name on this wall represents choices made in impossible circumstances, lives spent in service to something larger than themselves. We honor them not by forgetting who they were, but by teaching others to be better than we were, to fight smarter, to come home more often, and to remember that the point of war is peace. After the ceremony, Cale walked among the attendees, accepting quiet thanks and respectful nods. She'd become something she never expected to be, a symbol of redemption, proof that people who'd done dark work could find their way back to the light. A young lieutenant approached her nervously, a woman whose uniform showed deployment ribbons and combat medals. Ma'am, she said, I wanted to thank you for the program, for what you've taught us. Cale studied her, seeing in her face the same determination she'd once carried. What's your name? Lieutenant Sarah Chen, ma'am. Chen, not Sarah. Close enough to the generic names Cale had avoided in her stories, but real nonetheless. And what did the program teach you that you think matters most? Chen considered the question seriously. It taught me that being afraid doesn't make me weak, and that asking for help doesn't make me less capable. It taught me that the strongest operators aren't the ones who never fall down, but the ones who get back up and help others to their feet. Kale felt something settle in her chest, a warmth that might have been pride or might have been peace. She extended her hand. Then you learned exactly what I was hoping to teach. Chen shook her hand, held it for a moment longer than protocol required. I heard stories about you, ma'am. About the missions, about Yemen, about everything. And I just wanted you to know that those stories, they inspired me to be better. Not just as a soldier, but as a person. That's all we can hope for, Kale said. That the next generation learns from our mistakes and does better than we did. Chen saluted and walked away, leaving Kale standing alone in front of the memorial. She reached out and touched her own name, feeling the cold granite beneath her fingers. She was real again, officially existing, acknowledged and remembered. It should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like finally being able to rest. Morrison found her an hour later, sitting on a bench overlooking the base's main thoroughfare. He sat beside her without speaking, and they watched soldiers go about their business in comfortable silence. Finally, he broke it. "What are you thinking about?" She didn't answer immediately, still processing the weight of the morning. "I'm thinking about all the versions of myself I've been," she said finally. The operator who thought killing for the right reasons made her righteous. The ghost who thought being dead meant being free. The instructor who thought teaching could atone for everything else. And now, she said, "I'm just trying to be someone who lived through darkness and didn't let it consume her." Morrison nodded. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met. Not because of how many missions you survived or how many people you saved, but because you kept trying to become better even when it would have been easier to stay broken." She looked at him, this young man who'd become like a brother, who'd followed her into combat and stayed by her side during peace. "That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me." He smiled. "Don't let it go to your head, madam. You're still terrifying when you want to be." "Good," she said, matching his smile. "Someone has to keep you all honest." They sat together as the sun broke through the clouds, washing the base in golden light. Kale closed her eyes and let it warm her face, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember something approaching contentment. Not happiness, not quite, but the knowledge that she'd taken everything that had been done to her and everything she'd done to others and somehow transformed it into something worth preserving. 10 years after her resurrection, Major Cale Torrance stood in a Pentagon briefing room, presenting the Shepard program's decade-long results to a room full of stars and policymakers. The statistics were impressive. 40% reduction in combat fatalities among units that completed Shepard training. 60% improvement in mission success rates. 75% increase in operator retention and career satisfaction. But more important than the numbers were the testimonials, the stories from soldiers who credited their survival to training that prepared them for reality rather than theory. As she concluded her presentation, a four-star general she didn't recognize raised his hand. "Major Torrance, you've built something remarkable here, but I have to ask, what's next? What does the Shepard program look like in another 10 years? Kale had been expecting the question. She'd spent months developing the answer. "Sir, the next phase is internationalization. We've proven that this training saves lives. Now we need to share it with our allies, create a global standard for special operations training that keeps the best operators alive and effective without burning them out." The room absorbed this, seeing the vision she was proposing. The general nodded. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary," she replied. "The wars we're fighting don't respect borders, and neither should the training that prepares people to fight them." Another general spoke up, a woman with more combat ribbons than Kale had ever seen on one uniform. "Major, you've mentioned several times that one goal of Shepard is to keep operators from burning out. Yet you yourself experienced severe burnout before being, and I'm quoting your file here, resurrected. How do you reconcile that?" Kale met her eyes directly. "Ma'am, I reconcile it by acknowledging that I'm a cautionary tale, not a role model. Everything I teach comes from mistakes I made and prices I paid. The goal isn't to create more operators like me. It's to create operators who are better than I was, who learn to recognize their limits before they break, and who understand that asking for help is a tactical skill rather than a weakness. The briefing ended with authorization to expand the Shepherd program internationally, along with a promotion that Cale hadn't requested but accepted anyway. Lieutenant Colonel Torrance now, with responsibility for a program that had grown far beyond anything she'd imagined when Vance first offered her a chance to teach. The ceremony was private, just Vance pinning the new rank insignia on her uniform while Morrison and a handful of others watched. She looked down at the silver oak leaves and felt the weight of them, literal and metaphorical. "Sir," she said to Vance, "I need to ask you something." He nodded, understanding that this was important. "When you offered me the chance to teach all those years ago, did you know it would become this?" He considered his answer carefully. "I knew you were too valuable to waste, and I knew that the military was making the same mistake with a lot of good people. So no, I didn't know it would become this big. But I knew it was necessary." She absorbed this. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Vance smiled, rare and genuine. "Cale, you saved yourself. I just gave you the opportunity." That night, alone in her quarters, she opened the safe and took out Keating's folder one more time. She read through her operational history again, seeing it now with the perspective of a decade spent teaching others. The missions looked different through that lens. Not justified or unjustified.